Okay, today we're going to be doing two short things, one on Tzadi Ches Beis and one on Tzadi Ches Gimel. So, okay, we'll start with Tzadi Ches Beis. In a lot of Hilchos Taruvos, there's a difference between whether something is min b'mino, min b'she'ini mino. Min b'mino means the items are similar, min b'she'ini mino means they're not similar. Okay, so what happens but if we have a mixture which is both min b'mino and min b'she'ini mino at the same time? I'll give an example. When you have an egg yolk that's still inside the chicken and it's attached to the chicken's ovary, that's called an ovum, or one or a few. I don't know the right way to say it is, but it's called an ovum. Okay, mid-daraisa, those ovum, while they're still in the chicken, if the chicken is shechted, it is killed or dies without shechita, those ovum are asur mid-daraisa. Okay, so now what happens if someone takes one of those ovum, basically it's an egg yolk, and he mixes it into liquid eggs. And the cracked eggs that he mixes it into have both yolk and egg white, the albumin. Okay, it's all mixed together. So what's happened is that the ovum, which is usr, now fell into the egg, which is mutter, and it's min b'mino with the yolks that are in there, but it's min b'she'ein mino with the whites. So which one is it? Do we look at this? Do we give it the status of a min b'mino mixture or a min b'she'ein mino? Which way do we treat it? So the answer to that question starts with a Gemara. Gemara in Chulchan, in Aruch, and Kashrus, which talks about a similar situation, but a little bit differently. And that is, Rabbi Yehuda's shita is that mixtures that are min b'mino can never be bitul. Okay, so if you have a mixture according to Rabbi Yehuda, which is partially min b'mino and partially min b'she'ein mino, so I'm sorry, if it's just a mino that's just min b'mino, it's also, even if there's 1,000 times as much, it makes no difference. No matter what, min b'mino cannot be bitul. So what happens if we have a mixture that's min b'mino, min b'she'ein mino? So the min b'mino part can't be bitul, but min b'she'ein mino could be bitul according to the regular rules of shishim or whatever. And the Gemara says like this: "There's kol min b'mino v'davar acher." Okay, so it's min b'mino and min b'she'ein mino. Salek es mino k'mi she'ein. Ignore the she'ein mino. The mino, which according to beauty can't be bitul, the she'ein mino rabbi lama mavatlai, and just look at the interaction between the iser and the part that's ein mino, and then it could be bitul, no problem, and then it could be bitul. And so the ein mino part works. So it means is even though one part can't do bitul, the mino part can't do bitul. It's not capable of doing bitul because the Yehuda holds min b'mino does not do bitul. But there's a min b'she'ein mino part, and that part can do bitul, and therefore that's in fact what happens. So the min b'she'ein mino part is mvatal, and it works. Okay, we call that, for sure, we call that Salek. Okay, so the din is not like Rabbi Yehuda. We don't pass on like Rabbi Yehuda on that min b'mino not being bitul, and therefore this din, the way the Gemara says Salek, is not brought in Hilchos Taruvos. Excuse me, because the concept that min b'mino has this chumrah doesn't apply. It happens to be, just as a sort of an aside, it actually is brought, we talked about this when we learned halachas of Stam Yain, that the Gemara makes a similar point of a different case, which was, what happens if wine which is asur, wine which is truma, gets mixed into a mixture of wine and water, which is to say in those days they would dilute their wine with water. So we have this diluted wine and water, and into it falls wine of truma. So the din there is that the wine cannot be bitul into the other wine. In that case, min b'mino is not bitul. So then, so over there we say the min b'mino part of it cannot be bitul, but we say salek es mino. Ignore the fact that there's the wine is min b'mino with the other wine, and then say she'ein mino. The water can be mevatel the wine. Okay, and that's what the Gemara says. In Avodah Zarah, I'm sorry, on Ayin Gimel Beis, the Gemara says that about a case of wine, and in fact, that Gemara is the source for a din that many people know, which is that wine can be bitul b'shisha, 6 times as much. It comes out of that whole Gemara, that discussion in the Gemara about how you say Salek is a case where it's 6 times as much, and from there we learn out the din that wine can be bitul in 6 times when it's diluted 6 times as much. So this din of Salek, that we ignore the mino and we only look at the ein mino, is not brought in Hilchos Taruvos because we don't pass on Yehuda, but it is brought, essentially it's brought in what we learned from that case is brought in Hilchas Taimei. So now our halacha, or in our Tzadik Chesed Beis, actually is an application that we're trying to make from that Gemara, and that is Rabbi Yehuda holds that min b'mino is stricter than min b'she'ini mino. That min b'mino can have no bitul no matter what. But we actually paskin the opposite. We hold that min b'mino is more kal. It's less strict. Because midaraisa we say that min b'mino is batal b'roi. And we own this that by min b'mino that we need shishim, that's only a drabanan. As opposed to min b'she'eni mino, if midaraisa you need to have shishim. So therefore what? The Rishonim say, just like in the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda said, we can Salek es mino, ignore the mino and let the Eino mino do its thing and let it do Bitul. So too, when we have a case of something mixed into mino and Eino mino, according to us, we could ignore the Eino mino and let the mino do its thing. Because according to us, min b'mino is more kal. And we say, what our din says, our din Shulchan says, royana she'enoi mino ki'ilu enoi. We ignore the Eino mino, the hashar mino, and the rest, which is the mino rubble of a vatla, and it could do its trick. It could do bitul beroiv, in this case midaraisa, and then the drabanan falls into its place afterwards. Okay, so at first glance, it seems like the Gemara is basically just, these Rishonim are just turning around what the Gemara said. Essentially, it's the same idea. You could, when there's a mixture of mino and she'enim mino, you select the part that is not so good for you, and you only count the part that is good for you, and you let Bitul happen according to the rules of what's good for you. Okay, but there's something wrong with that. There's some, if you think about it a little bit more, there's a Taz and Shach's question, is that it doesn't really make so much sense by us, because by us, the reason why min b'she'enim mino can't be batal is not because the Eino mino is sort of like not strong enough, or it's just a rule. It's like Rabbi Yehuda can never be batal on this and that. No. The reason why it can't be batal is because it was nice and tam. And we say tam kicker deraisa. It gave tam to the Eino mino. So what do you mean? Ignore the Eino mino and just think about the mino part of the mixture. But there's an Eino mino part of the mixture also, and that Eino mino part of the mixture was affected by the Isser, and that effect still happened, and it's tam kicker. So how could we ignore what happened over here? So I'm going to repeat over the answer to that question. We spoke about it in way back when, a long time ago, way back when, maybe it was in Sim Pei Zayin. I remember way back when we spoke about it. And we said, it was in Sim Pei Zayin. And we said like this. We said over an answer from Shulchan Aruch. He said like this. He says that this idea that we could say that Salek as she'einu mino, what our Shulchan Aruch says, this extension comes from Rashba. And he says, well, if we look at the sheet of the Rashba in a different place, in the Rashba in Chulin, this is the Rashba in Taras Abayis, I think it's Rashba in Taras Abayis. If we look at, it's Rashba in Taras Abayis. If we look at the Rashba in Chulin, he has a sheet of how Tam Kicker Deraisa works that will help us understand how he could say Salek in our case. And the Rashba says like this: the reason why Tam Kicker Deraisa, the reason why if Heter tastes like Isser becomes Usser, so we just think of it as well because it tastes like it, and that's it. Then if it tastes like it, it's Usser. He says no. He says when you taste the Isser in the Heter, it's as if you could see the Isser, and when you could see the Isser, it's not going to be batal. So the reason why it's batal is not because of the taste per se. It's because you could see it. If you see it, his words are Kishakibel Heter Tam Isser, Nasa Hakol Isser. It becomes Isser. Why? Shahari Nikaru V'Yadua Bakol B'Chol HaHeter, and the Isser is noticeable. Nikaru V'Yadua B'Chol HaHeter. It's noticeable in the whole Heter. Okay, so Sham Zam says like this: if Isser falls into Heter Min B'She'enim Mino, then that makes sense. You see, I can, so to speak, see the Isser over here because I taste it, and the tasting is like I'm sensing it. I notice this thing over here. It's as if I'm seeing it. He says, but what happens if there's mino of Heter also? So then that means is the Isser, and I can't detect the Isser because the Isser and the Heter are giving the same time to this food. It's min b'mino means is, like in the case I gave before in about egg yolks, the ovum and the egg yolk, they're both giving time into the whites. So if they're both giving time into the whites, then I can't say I see the Isser. No, you don't. What you see the time of egg yolk, that's a mix of Isser and Heter. So we don't say that. In that case, we wouldn't say Tam Kicker. Tam Kicker, according to the Rashba in Chulin says, Ikka means is I can see, I can detect the Isser, and therefore it can't be Batal. Well, that's not true when there's also mino of heter, because in that case we see a mixture of mino and of the two kinds of minos, and therefore it's not a case where we say tankik. Okay, so that's a hezbollah of how logically how it can make sense. In fact, it's the thing here, and that's what we do, which is we say Salek as she'eni mina, umina is rubble of mapatloi, or the way the Shulchan says, roin es she'eni mina kilu ena, v'hashar mina rubble of mapatloi. Now, I gave this example of a oval, not such a practical case. I mean, it's pretty rare that would happen. I don't want to say it's illegal, but it's close to that. But basically, it doesn't happen much nowadays. But when we get to the in Mitzvah Shem, we get to Simin Kuf Beis, and we talk about Davashesh Matirin. But there's a case. Mitzvah Shem will have a case there where Salek will have a practical application. Okay, now let's move on to Tzadi Chesif Gimel. Okay, now, when we were doing Tzadi Chesif Beis, the part we didn't talk about, it said the following. What happens if you had a mixture that was min b'minai? Okay, until now, today, I've been talking about it was mina and inu. Let's say just plain good old min b'minai. And we know that the mixture was, that the issur was bata b'rayv. But we're not sure if it was bata b'shishim or not. Okay, so then the din in Shulchan said you could be mekel. Why could you be mekel? Because midaraisa min b'mina is bata b'rayv. Since min b'mina is bata b'rayv, so midaraisa we know that this mixture is permitted. Midrabanan, you need to have shishim. Okay, midrabanan, you need to have shishim. We don't know if there was shishim. It's vague. It's not clear to us whether there was shishim or not. Well, since that's only a shaila of a drabanan, so we say Safek Chisaron Chochmah or Safek Chisaron Chochmah, and therefore we could be mekel and say we could assume that there was shishim and you're allowed to eat the food. Okay. Now, that was spoken about in Halacha Beis. In Halacha Gimel, the Shulchan Aruch, which is what we're talking about now, the Shulchan Aruch says wait, that kula only applies if the mixture or part of the mixture spilled out. So at this point, it's impossible to determine how much there was in the overall mixture. That's why we can't figure out if there was shishim. Meaning we know there was an ounce of heter. We know that left in the container now are 10 ounces altogether. Well, it only seems like there's 9 times as much heter as this, but some spilled out. We don't know if what spilled out was another 50 ounces or another 10 ounces. We don't know. So we just have no way of figuring it out. So that's why we have a soft gas so we can make them. But what happens if everything is still here, but somehow we can't figure it out? We're not smart enough to make the calculations to figure out whether there was bitul b'shishim. In that case, you cannot be mekel. Okay, so you can this kula that we had that we could say we could get ourselves to a point where it's only a safek d'rabanan, and we could therefore make a safek d'rabanan. The kula is only where it's spilled out, where it's impossible. We can't figure it out. But if it could be figured out, but we just somehow we're missing, we're not able to do it. In that case, we cannot say safek d'rabanan kula. Now, so the Shulchan Aruch is telling us that there are some things that you're not sure. But even though you're not sure about something, that's not good enough to qualify as a suffix for the rules like Safek Chisaron Chochmah. Okay, so you're not sure, but not every time you're not sure that's not good enough. Okay, so just as sort of an aside is that the Shach says in Kolis Sveka and other places, he says is the same thing is that suffix. So these kind of things that don't qualify as svekas are not going to be svekas for sveka either. He said makom hefsek ruba you could be mekel, but usually he says it wouldn't be good enough even for sveka either. Okay, and then there's another thing that the Shach by us says, based on Iran, that there are some times that it's not clear how much isser comes out of an item. He's talking about a chal, whatever, but they're not sure how much it is. And the Chacham said that you should be choishish that the entire thing is isser, way more than is possible. It's not. No, everybody knows that that's not the truth. It's not possible that that's what it is. But Chacham said to choose this huger number because they want it to be mach, because it's not clear how much comes out. The Shach says in that kind of a case, Chazal specifically were trying to say, don't make your own judgment. And therefore, that's also a case where we would not consider it a suffix just because you're not sure. We wouldn't say, oh, well, I know I'm being super machmer. Everybody knows that. We're being super machmer, and therefore it's a suffix. He says, no, it's not a suffix. Chazal are specifically saying, don't treat this as a suffix. Okay. Anyhow, now this rule that by us we say is, if you're not sure, but even though you're not sure, that's not good enough to qualify as a suffix, right? That's what's going on over here. The Shach, in a few places, calls that a Safek Chisaron Chochmah. Now, if we were to translate that literally, that means it's something that you're not sure about. It's a suffix based on a lack of knowledge. Chisaron Chochmah, you're missing knowledge. Okay? And one of the explanations given, we don't have to go to all the other ones for now, but one of the explanations given is that da shaitim huzeh. This is what the fact that you don't know something is because you're just, you're an imbecile. You just don't know something. You're in this case, you're a shaita. So that doesn't count. Chazal, when we make decisions about something mutter or usher, we don't say, well, you are such a fool that you don't know this information, so we could be making it. That doesn't work like that. You have to look what would be a typical average person should know or does know, and therefore the fact that you happen to just be such a fool that you don't know this piece of information, that doesn't let you be maker. You can't say, oh my gosh, now I'm a suffix dabban. Okay, that's what the Shach says. Now, if we would take the Shach, I said the Shach says this, but other people use similar wording. There are other people who use similar wording. Now, if we were to take this at face value, that means is, if there's something that people could know, it's possible to know it. I happen to not know it, but other people, but if it's possible that people could know this piece of information, that doesn't count as a suffix. Now, that in itself would be very limiting. It would make Sveikas we would have very few cases that we could say Safek Chisaron Chochmah. But the truth is, if we dig a little deeper, it turns out that it's not even possible. I can't say it's not possible. It's very hard to believe that that's really pshat in the din over here. Why? Because there's a machlokes between Taz and Shach about what happens if it's not just that I don't know it, not just that I'm the fool, I'm the shaita who doesn't know this piece of information. No. There's nobody at all who knows this piece of information. Nobody at all knows this thing. So the Taz says, well, if nobody knows it, it's a suffix for him and to everybody, well then that's not Chisaron Chochmah. It's not, we're not missing a piece of information. Nobody knows this. I don't mean nobody, I don't know if that means 100% nobody. Essentially nobody knows it. Nobody knows it, then that is considered a suffix. That's what the Taz says. Okay? The Shach says, no, even if nobody knows it, it makes no difference. If it's a Chisaron Chochmah, then it makes a difference if one person doesn't know it or a million people don't know it. If nobody knows it, same thing, still Safek Chisaron Chochmah. So let's think for a second. The Shach is saying that if it's a Chisaron Chochmah, that there is nobody at all who knows it, then that's also that's not considered a suffix either. Okay, so then according to the Shach, what's the case that's going to be a suffix? Yes, we can come up with. There are some cases that we could come up with, but it means is almost never will there be something that counts as Safek Chisaron Chochmah, because if there's something that nobody knows, nobody could know this piece of information, and yet you say, too bad, that's not considered Safek Chisaron Chochmah. So there's almost nothing that's going to count as a suffix. So I guess it could be like that. I guess it could be, but it makes it very hard to believe that that's really, that qualifies as, those kind of things are not considered a suffix either. Okay? I mean, again, you could say not like that, but it's hard to believe that that's what it could mean. The Shach does have one thing he says. I'll tell you one thing he says. I'll tell you it's considered a suffix. He says, what happens if there's something that I feel qualified. I have his examples. I have a sircha on an animal, on a lung, and I feel very qualified to decide whether there's really a hole in the lung or not. I see something there, but there's this rule that we consider ourselves in a bekim. We don't check this certain kind of a thing. He says, the Shach says there, he's masking that that's just a chumrah. But from my perspective, I would have happily determined whether this thing is mutter aser. The sort of the minig is a chum on top of that he considers this up. Okay, so it seems to me that the term Safek Chisaron Chochmah, we shouldn't take it at face value. Rather, we should look the way the Pri Megadim says it. Even the Shach himself says it in other places. Okay, the Pri Megadim doesn't call it a Safek Chisaron Chochmah. He calls it a Safek Chisaron Chochmah, which means it's something that you're not sure of because of you're missing wisdom. Okay, there's something, you're missing some kind of a wisdom to figure this out. Or the Shach in one place calls it a Safek Haba Mimir Hakara. You don't recognize that. Those words are actually coming right out of a Rajman Tarsabayis. Or the Taz calls it a Chisaron Bekias. Or, and sometimes the Taz calls it a Mir Yedia She'enu Yodea Lahakir. Again, so all of these are saying is, all of these ways of saying this, explaining the same din, are saying that we know the facts. Everybody knows what happened. The situation is correct. We know what the facts are, but we don't know how to interpret the facts that we're seeing. That's something that's a Safek Chisaron Chochmah. It's not that we're missing, and not again the word. So we're saying the wording of the Shach of Safek Chisaron Yediyah shouldn't be taken literally. We're missing knowledge. No. If you're missing knowledge, that's a Safek. But if you're missing Chochmah, if you're missing the ability to interpret that knowledge, that information that you have, that's a Chisaron that doesn't count as a Safek. We say Da Shaitim, you're just not smart enough to figure out how to understand it. That doesn't count as a Safek. For example. This is an example that comes from Simon Tzadi Gimel. I'm sorry, Nun Gimel, and the way the Shach explains it over there. Okay, after an animal was shechted, they see that the chicken's wing came out of its socket. Okay, and it could be that if that happened, that it punctured the chicken's lung, which would make the bird into a treifa. Okay, so we know what happened. We know that the wing is out of its socket. There's no question about that. Everyone can see that that's what happened. We just don't have the skill to now look at a lung and decide whether there was a puncture or there was no puncture. Okay, so in that case, if there's no lack of knowledge, we know the information, the facts on the ground. We know what happened. The facts are there that the wing was dislodged, and that's what's raising the question over here. But we don't have the chokhmah to figure out whether the animal's a treifa. We still don't. Even knowing everything, we still can't figure out whether the animal's a treifa or not. And therefore, that is the case where we don't consider it to be a Safek. Now, the Shach, now we come to Taz and the Shach. The Taz would say, but if nobody can figure it out, that would be a Safek. And the Shach says, no, even if nobody can figure it out, that's still considered to be a Safek. So, for example, we spoke about, a different time, we spoke about, when we talked about Te'ima of Safek Isser. And we said a whole bunch of the cases there about tasting Safek Isser were, there's glycerin in a food, but we don't know whether the glycerin is kosher or treif. So in that case, we're missing a fact. We don't know whether the glycerin is kosher or the glycerin is treif. That's considered a Safek. And therefore we can, however we said kulas and over there based on it being a Safek, that's okay. We can make a Safek out of it because it is. We don't know whether the ingredient is kosher or treif. It's not a case, that's not considered to be an interpretation. There isn't any interpretation that has to happen. It's either kosher or it's treif. It's not an interpretation that we have to figure out. And that's the case that is considered to be a Safek. And so so again, the short version of what we're saying is that even though the Shach called it a Safek Chisaron Yediyah, in some places, like right by Ardin, he calls it that, it would be more accurate to call that a Safek Chisaron Chochmah or Hakara or things like that, that the person does not know how to interpret it, and that's the cases where you're being unsure doesn't count as a Safek to say Safek Chisaron Makul.